All right, everybody, here we go with the notes for Chapter 2, Primetime Network Program Strategies. These notes are broken up into 4 different videos, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Broadcast television networks serve 3 key functions. First off, the networks often act as loss leaders, drawing attention to programs and their stars, helping the profits of their O&O stations, O&O meaning owned and operated, cable networks, theme parks, publishing, and other commercial interests. So if we think about the fact that broadcast networks are generally going to be owned by larger corporations that have several other different ventures that are going on, one of the main roles of the networks these days is to help bolster the bottom lines of the other businesses that are part of the umbrella of that particular company. Broadcast television networks also serve as systems for cross-promoting other less visible corporate counterparts. So it's a huge, glorified advertising machine, if you will. The things that you watch on television, the shows, the actors, they're promoting other things that that company has a vested interest in. If you've watched CBS News in the past several weeks, you've heard them in their news stories talking about books that have been published by Simon & Schuster, which is also owned by the same company that owns Viacom CBS. Thirdly, broadcast television networks deflect criticism from other aspects of the company's business. It's almost kind of the PR mouthpiece of the corporation as a whole. And additionally, networks represent brand names that are known around the world. Again, the network is just one piece of an overall larger corporation's portfolio. Blurring the boundaries, competitors working together. We're seeing this happening more and more. For example, when the CW network came to being, that was a co-op of CBS and Time Warner. They're 2 separate companies, but they both have an interest in the CW network. Hulu has a lot of different competitors that are working together to make that forum effective. Disney ABC is involved, Fox is involved, NBC is involved, several other companies also working to help make Hulu what it is. You've heard the term prime time. Prime time is generally accepted as the evening hours of broadcast television. 6 days a week, that's the hours of 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Time. And on Sundays, it starts at 7 p.m. Now, this is traditionally when the major 3 networks are going to be broadcasting their main network programming, but smaller networks may choose to not air network programming during all of those primetime hours. Matter of fact, Fox Network still quits its primetime lineup at 10 p.m. to allow for local affiliates to air a 10 o'clock newscast. CW does the same thing. Primetime programs are the traditional source of virtually all off-network, online, and a lot of foreign syndication, plus DVD, tablet, and smartphone sales, and in consequence remains the center of long-term profit potential. It has become more and more popular for people to purchase seasons of their favorite programming when it comes available on DVD or these days subscriptions to your favorite streaming service, or to purchase as a download for you to keep forever and ever in that way as well. But besides just airing it on the networks and getting the ratings for those, it's also seen an incredible uptick in revenue from the sales in these different venues. Primetime is still the most heavily promoted and most talked about part of any schedule. Doesn't seem to happen as much these days because a lot of us will watch programming that is meant for over-the-air broadcast through alternative means like watching on streaming or on demand or things like that. So the conversations aren't necessarily as immediate as they were in the past, where people would go to work or go to school the next day and be like, hey, did you watch this program last night? And talk about what happened. It still happens to a certain extent, especially with shows that have a competitive sort of feel to them, whether it's a sports broadcast or some of the reality type competition shows like American Idol and things like that. But by and large, primetime programming is still what's going to be talked about the most out of any other programming that airs on television or cable. Some of the ways that airwaves have been used and still are used, first off, they're used to cross-promote their other businesses. I mentioned the CBS Simon & Schuster example not all that long ago. NBC also owns Universal, so it's going to promote Universal theatrical releases. It's going to promote Universal theme parks. Cross-promotion. Airwaves are also used to influence government. They are very much becoming more and more vocal in terms of their point of view on various political issues, not just within their industry, but within the culture in general. So we're seeing that more and more. Airwaves are also used to swallow or defeat competitive threats. Someone's getting too much market share, taking away business from you. Well, you can use your airwaves to try to combat that. That's been something that's happened in a little more subtle sort of way, but it does happen quite a bit. Probably the most prominent way that we see that happen is in the news environment, where the broadcast news networks, the cable news networks, are willing to pretty openly bash each other in terms of the type of coverage that they offer, or at times the lack of coverage of certain things. Bad decisions made by programmers can affect the legendary programs that they air and affect their overall ratings. Several years ago, when O.J. Simpson released his book, If I Did It, well, Fox got a whole lot of flack for promoting that book along with HarperCollins. There's the infamous wardrobe malfunction that happened during the 2014 Super Bowl that is still talked about and has made a huge impact in conversations with the FCC about how strongly they are going to enforce indecency rules. And then late night talk has for a long time been something that's had a bit of controversy to it. When Conan O'Brien originally took over Jay Leno's Tonight Show, that was a huge thing for a while. Before that, David Letterman versus Jay Leno when Johnny Carson retired from the Tonight Show. And you still see a lot of late night wars that are going on these days, although it's kind of become more of a friendly competition as far as that goes. But things still happen, and there's still scandals that happen in television. This is more applying to syndication, but in recent headlines, there's been conversations about the Ellen DeGeneres talk show and some of the things that happens behind the scenes, and some of the employees that were recently let go from that show. Let's talk about vertical integration. This became possible in 1996 with the passing of the Telecommunications Act. That particular law actually did a lot for broadcast television and radio. What we're going to focus on here in this aspect is the idea that networks are now allowed to own stations. So an example here in the Raleigh market, WTVD, Channel 11. It is not just an ABC affiliate, but the ABC television network owns Channel 11. Prior to 1996, they wouldn't have been allowed to do that. Later FCC action allowed more cross-ownership across TV, radio, and print. It's not unusual to find media companies that own two television stations in a market. The example here in Raleigh, Capital Broadcasting owning both WRAL Channel 5 and WRAZ Channel 50. And you've also got the two stations that are owned by Sinclair, Channel 22 and Channel 28. Radio, you definitely see this where a company can own as many as 8 radio stations in a radio market. Removal of the financial interest rules covering program ownership limits paved the way for broadcast companies to also own production houses. So in essence, this winds up shutting out competition from independent production houses, and you're finding that networks are not purchasing programming content from outside vendors as much anymore because they have the ability to do it themselves now. Most of the programs that you see on networks these days, they have at least a partial ownership of, as opposed to, again, going out searching for programs and purchasing them from these individual production houses. Business decisions made by the parent corporation sometimes adversely affects their broadcast outlets. You have issues between networks and cable companies, satellite companies, with the retransmission, the carriage contracts, which can result in networks being taken off of channel lineups. Last year, there was a huge dispute between Fox Network and I think it was Dish TV. It might have been DirecTV. But it kept Fox off of that particular satellite service for several months while they talked about retransmission fees. Then you've also got, in the case of NBC, where it owns Comcast. That creates some muddy waters there for those that are trying to have their network carried on Comcast from time to time. You have actor and union negotiations. You have strikes that happen that can cause problems. When there was the writer's strike that happened a few years ago, and that affected a good bit of programming, especially the late night talk shows. Loyal viewers that are forced to change their viewing habits rarely change back. It's the tuning inertia program. Let's try that again. The tuning inertia issue, where if something happens to a viewer's favorite program and it causes that viewer to either watch something else or do something else at the particular time that show was on, if and when the show comes back, they might not get the viewer back because the viewer is already into the habit of watching or doing something else. Finally, production costs have gotten too high for broadcast outlets. Cable can do it cheaper. So that has gotten to where cable has become more and more of a player, continuing to chip away at the ratings of the networks. It was a huge deal, I think this was about 10 years ago, when Discovery Channel had a show that wound up winning the ratings for that particular evening. It was the first time that a cable network had beat the broadcast boys. And we're starting to see more and more that even though as a individual network, a lot of cable outlets don't beat broadcast ratings, that as a whole, cable very mightily beats broadcast quite often. Diminishing audiences. By 2011, individual cable shows airing in prime time were getting bigger audiences than shows on broadcast. Just talked about that briefly. cable continues to get more and more of the share. Now, the primetime advertising game. As time goes on, more ads are on the air, and they're going for higher rates, but you're also getting fewer new episodes of a particular program per season. Cost of everything is going up. Networks are trying to recoup their losses to continue to build their revenue, and you see these sort of practices going on. One way to mitigate that a little bit is through a concept called the upfront sales period. In the upfront sales period, advertisers pay in advance for choice ad slots in fall programming. Rates are based on estimated ratings and certain guarantees to advertisers. So there is a bit of a risk here for the advertiser in that they may not necessarily know what programs are going to be on the air at what particular times, especially if the network is introducing new programming. So they're taking a chance based on preliminary reviews, based on the projections that the networks are giving to their prospective clients. But they're also locking in what are probably going to be the lowest advertising rates that they're going to be able to get by locking in well before the new season starts. The primetime advertising game also including package deals. Sometimes to buy a top-rated show, an advertiser must also agree to buy a lesser-rated show. So if you want to buy into one of the top-rated shows on a particular network, they'll let you do it, but they may also require that you buy during other time slots as well. Advertisers started fighting back in the mid-aughts. Many large advertisers refused to accept increases from broadcast advertising rates, turning to internet and cable. And by 2008, advertisers had balked at what were called integration fees. These were fees that were charged to have a spot manually placed into its time slot, because by and large everyone's doing automation now. So this was basically a bogus fee in the minds of many advertising clients. So even with up to that point, the networks kind of being able to get away with increasing rates on advertising, even though audiences have been dwindling little by little. By the time we get to the mid-2000s, we're starting to see that basically the pool that the networks had is dwindling, and they can't necessarily command as much for receiving the services of advertising. It made the broadcasters think a little bit. Now, the problem with reality. While reality programs may be cheap to produce, the lack of potential revenue from other means diminishes as a result. So what do we mean by that? Reality programs tend to be very much focused on what is happening here and now, whether it's a competition type of show like Survivor, or if it's more in terms of trying to be more slice of life, kind of like Real Housewives or Jersey Shore or something like that, where it's interesting to watch people living in the here and now. So as a result, those shows don't syndicate as well, they don't rerun as well, and most people are not looking to buy those shows either on DVD or download or whatever. Cross-ownership and cross-promotion does allow for profits of the overall corporation, even if the broadcast network itself loses revenue. We see this with shows like American Idol and Glee on Fox, where they get a lot of money from promotion of merchandising, promotion of, in the case of American Idol, they would go out on tour and do concerts. That would be a huge moneymaker for Fox. So sometimes just in the aspect of promoting some of these other ventures besides the program itself, that's where the network can make a good bit of its money. Product placement, widely used by lesser networks, eventually larger networks also embracing the idea. Let's look at American Idol again. A lot of those competition type shows where they're drinking out of a Pepsi or a Coke cup. That's intentional. Virtual advertising is product placement that is digitally inserted in the programming. There's a couple of ways that this happens. The most prominent way that we can think of is during sports broadcasts, especially baseball. There's some networks that will superimpose a advertising graphic behind the batter, and that will change from batter to batter or from inning to inning for different advertising placements there. It can also happen with literal products themselves. Say an actor is drinking a can of Coke in the original recording of a show. Well, Pepsi comes in and wants to do some product placement. They can basically digitize out the Coke logo, put in the Pepsi logo. Multiplatform Strategies, popular programming becoming available on screens of all types, such as health clubs, universities, grocery stores. I've noticed a lot going into doctors' offices that you've got a TV screen in the waiting room. They're piping in a special network of health-related programming, and that becomes a way to do promotion and even some advertising revenue. One thing that's happening more and more in the past 10, 15 years or so, runaway production. Show production is moving out of Los Angeles and into other parts of the country, largely because the costs to produce content are going to be lower because you don't have to deal with the unions as much. There may be tax incentives that are offered by certain cities or certain states. Georgia is a pretty significant one that does that, so you're seeing a lot of programming produced in Georgia these days. A lot of other states are doing that. North Carolina has its own program where it entices for TV and movie productions to get certain incentives when they film in our state. So that's a good place to stop for now. In order to continue with your notes, check out the video labeled Part B for Chapter 2.